From the Lean Enterprise Institute in Boston, this is the WLEI Podcast, where we share stories of people making the world better through lean thinking and practice. For more information about LEI, including how we can help you apply lean thinking, please visit lean.org.
So welcome to the Management Brief. This month, Mark Reich and I are talking with eminent individuals who've taken their career learnings and developed approaches for creating high-performing, continuously improving organizations. Today, we are joined by Nelson Repenning, co-author of the recently published There's Got to Be a Better Way. By the way, Nelson, before we get started, when I was working for Starbucks, we had a whole program, an initiative, I guess, multi-year initiative rooted in lean principles that was given the internal marketing name of Better Ways. So anyway, the title of your book resonated perfectly with me. Okay, so I guess just to get things started, I'll ask you to introduce yourself, tell us a little bit about your career, and I guess maybe jump right into the story of how you became acquainted with the concepts that are in your book about high-performing, continuously improving organizations.
Sure. Thanks. So first off, great to be here. Nice to see both of you. So my name is Nelson Repenning. I am a faculty member at MIT, and I'm an MIT lifer. So I showed up as a grad student on my 23rd birthday, expecting to be there for 4 or 5 years and then go off and teach somewhere else. I think I'm closing in on 30 years as a faculty member and then 5 years as a student before. And I always say, I think to motivate the book, that I've only really worked on one problem my whole career, which basically boils down to why don't people use the tools and practices that we would all agree are good things to do, and have purposely chosen tools typically where there's a lot of data and evidence to their effectiveness. So then that poses this interesting question: if there's so much data that this is a good thing to do, why don't people use it on a regular basis? The lean tools obviously fall into that category, and we'll probably talk about that pretty extensively over the course of our time together. But I've also studied things like basic safety practices in hospitals. I spent quite a bit of time on safety practices in high hazard industries, mostly in the energy industry. And I would say the arc of my career kind of leading up to the book is there's sort of two pieces. The first half of my career was very much diagnostic, so trying to explain why people didn't use new tools. And that led to this phenomenon that we call the capability trap or the firefighting trap, which we can go into a little bit more. But it's basically a story for why organizations struggle to do new things. But I think once I sort of had that diagnosis sort of pulled together, there was always this awkward moment when I would give talks about this stuff where I would go on for 50 minutes about why this bad thing happened and that bad thing happened, and the audience like, yeah, that happens in my organization. And so I felt like I had them in the palm of my hand. And then usually somewhere near the end, someone would say, okay, great, I got it. What should we do about it? And then I would kind of look at my watch and utter a few platitudes and try to get out of the room as fast as I could, because quite frankly, I didn't really have a good story other than maybe do less stuff, which I think, while correct, never worked. And so, the origin of the book, There's Got to Be a Better Way, really was Don Kiefer, my co-authors, and I attempt to try to understand, what do you do about it? And I think it took us 10 or 15 years to combine his practical experience and my kind of more academic-y approach into a set of principles that we think has the hope of making a dent into this and creating an organization that is both more effective, but I think is really much more capable of pulling new techniques and learnings and tools towards them in a way that they can actually use. And so that was kind of the arc that got us there, and then we can probably go back through that in any place that you want.
Since Don's not with us today, maybe you could just tell us briefly, too, a little bit about your co-author, Don Kiefer, and his background and kind of how that informs the book.
Yeah, so Don and I met in 1996. I think I had defended my PhD literally the day before. So I was a newly minted PhD, and we had a research grant at MIT one of the conditions of the research grant, which was unusual for the National Science Foundation at the time, is you had to have partner companies. So they were trying to make the research a little bit more practical. And Harley-Davidson was one of our partner companies. And so I was there for a set of meetings with my contact and interviewing. And I was walking down the hallway going one direction with my contact, Ron Hutchinson, who was the manager of quality for Harley at the point. And he said, oh, you should really talk to this guy Kiefer. And Don was walking the other way, and we ended up having lunch and I think really just hit it off. And I think, the nature of our tag team ever since has been I am the academic and he is the practitioner. And I sometimes describe it when I speak about it as he'll run into my office and say, oh, Nelson, I just did this project at company X and, we made a 30% improvement. And I'll kind of push my chair back and say, well, okay, so it works in practice, but does this work in theory? which is the thing that I care about. But I hope the magic of that is, he's been really focused on making organizations work better. And my part of this has been to try to distill the more general lessons from those experiences, hopefully into a methodology that is not industry specific or even technique specific, but that leaders and managers can use to make their organizations work better. And so, we go back and forth. I think both our spouses think that we argue like an old married couple at some points, but hopefully it's been productive tension. And then the book is really the product of that kind of batting the ideas back and forth.
Nice. So the Broad Institute, and specifically its kind of work around research grants, is really central to your book. I mean, you've got lots of cases in the book. That one is really woven throughout the entire thing. Maybe you could talk a little bit about how did dynamic work design, which is sort of the main idea of the book, briefly sort of explain that, and problem solving, get work to flow for research grants at the Broad Institute. What was it about dynamic work design that helped them with their problem to solve?
Yeah, so let me answer that maybe from two directions. I think the first one is that, at least in my career, my experience has always been that I've had the puzzle pieces long before I could put them all together and really see the big picture. So I think in Don's and my collaboration, as we started trying to work with organizations to help them work better, we had a set of tools and practices, many of which will be familiar to both of you because there's analogs in the lean canon as well. And we knew they worked, but as we tried to sort of distill the essential lessons from them and unify them, I think it took us a long time to realize that the core problem they were really solving, at least this is the way that we think about it, is that most of the standard management practices, budgeting, strategy, human resource planning, capital planning, and the like, all pretty much implicitly presume that we can forecast the future with some degree of accuracy. So we make a plan for this year's budget, right? We presume that we have some sense of what's going to happen over the course of the next 12 months. And at the same time, we all know that's not true because every popular business article starts with the sentence, the world is changing faster than it ever has before. And I actually have no idea whether that's true. I'm guessing in 1850, it felt like the world was changing pretty fast then too. But there is no question that managers face a high degree of change, and it's very hard to forecast the future. And so I think what we realized is that when we had the puzzle pieces of all these tools, and I would put the lean tools in that category for sure, what they really boil down to is if we accept that the world is not perfectly predictable, we might go back and design some of our core processes a little bit differently to create an organization that not only plans, but also is capable from learning from experience and adapting to the new information they get as they go. So that's kind of the big idea. And then I think the where that connects to Broad is we were enormously lucky to have them as our lead users. Sheila Dodge, who stars throughout the book, was a student of mine in our EMBA program. And, at least my recollection is didn't say a word during the course of her 2 years that she was there until the last week. She gave this fabulous presentation about the challenges she was facing in their operations. And as she's walking out the door, I said, I got a couple friends I think could help you with some of these operational challenges. And then from that, have just done wildly impressive things in terms of making their operations work better. But one of the things I've discovered as we've started to collect these examples is you all know well that most examples are a little bit complicated and have some nuance to them. But once in a while, you come across one that is just such a clean, perfect demonstration of the tools that it really has a huge amount of teaching value. And the example that you cited, Josh, which is they had a process there of approving research grants where somebody would get a grant or want to apply from the grant from National Science Foundation or National Institute of Health. And there's a lot of sort of various bureaucratic things that the grant receiving institution has to do before they can actually spend the money. And their process was just an enormous mess, and it took forever, and it frustrated everybody because it took so long. And then, kind of connecting to my earlier work on firefighting, researchers who were waiting for their money and got frustrated would start charging, expenses to other grants that already had open accounts, which then would have to be undone and reconciled later. And so it just created this huge amount of headache and, as researchers tried to work around. And so Sheila followed the dynamic work design principles in a really nice, clean way, which is they set some really clear targets. We want to get these grants approved in 10 days rather than the, 20 or 30 that are required. They mapped the process pretty carefully so you could see all the steps that went through. And then using one of the tools we talk a lot about in the book is they created a really simple visual management system to plot how the work was flowing or track how the work was flowing. And in this case, it was really just a whiteboard, a picture of the process, and then each research grant got a Post-it note that would move through each of the steps as you could see it. And that plus a 15-minute daily meeting, which is another one of our principles, revealed really quickly a bunch of big headaches and kind of poor design choices in that process of grant approval. And as we talk about in the book, probably the watershed moment of that was there was a step in the process where all the Post-its were accumulating, right? So that was clearly the bottleneck. And the person who was in charge of that came into the meeting one morning and said, I don't think I'm getting a lot of value from this process, because all the stuff was, backed up. I think I should be spending more time, back in my office approving these accounts or whatever the step was. And Sheila, to her credit, realized no, the solution is not for you to see if you can squeeze a couple more of these out, right? You clearly have a bottleneck. And they reconfigured some resources and moved stuff forward. And then the work started flowing dramatically. And then the other, I think, fun coda to this is there was another step in the process where senior leadership had to put in the final approval for the grant before it could be administered. And it turned out, of course, the senior leaders who had been complaining about how poorly the grant process was working were also a big bottleneck. And so they changed the escalation criteria and made it easier for them to get stuff done. A very simple project ex post, but I think, basically boiled down to, do we know what the targets are? Do we, have the right amount of work in the system? Do we understand where the bottlenecks are, and are we working to resolve those? And then do we have some kind of ongoing process where we're meeting regularly to catch the next improvement opportunity? And you put those things in place, as you all well know, and boy, you can get some really dramatic changes, right? So in their case, I think they went from a month to a couple of days in terms of how long it took to improve them. And I should say, by the way, we have exactly that same problem at the larger MIT, and I'm just begging them to see if we can work some similar magic for the larger institute, but to be continued at this moment.
Well, good luck with that.
Okay. All right, I'm going to pick up from there. I love that story, just because I'm working with a very large organization that looking at a quite similar problem of how to process legal contracts through the organization, and it takes forever. But just obviously my career, I came out of a manufacturing organization where you can often go out and see how product and process flows, but a lot of organizations don't. And so I think the ability and reading that in your book to demonstrate that example of how you make all that work visible adds so much credibility to the thinking, I think, in the community, because so many people deal with that. But I guess I want to take a step back to talk a little bit and kind of delve a little more into how your experience and your framework of thinking that you introduced in the book, Nelson. Maybe you could start by just sharing with us, and I know you've spoken already a bit to this, but how you started to organize, the understanding of organizational excellence, and that eventually led you to the development of the dynamic work design and that framework and how it's represented in There's Got to Be a Better Way.
So that's such a great question, Mark. And I would start with an observation I had pretty early in my career, which is I've studied lots of change initiatives, some successful and many that weren't successful. And I'd say the first thing that really jumped out at me, which for many years I didn't really quite know what to do with this observation, but certainly I had this experience that the successful ones almost always, if not always, started with what I perceived to be a new level of candor about the true state of the organization. Right? If you talk to practical managers, there's always this kind of rose-colored glasses thing that goes on about, where things are going pretty well and there's not that many big problems and we're not going to talk about them in the meeting because we don't want to get yelled at by our boss and so on and so forth. And then often in the successful change initiatives, a new person would walk in, and I think because they were new, they could say hey, this actually isn't really going well. Let's actually be honest about our cycle times, and let's be honest about our utilization, and let's be honest about, the big problems we have. And that once that happened, and people kind of got through the angst and the, stomach churning that went with that, then it seemed like the improvement really took off. And so I think from that observation and my experience of sort of seeing successful change initiatives versus the unsuccessful ones, what really came through to me, and I think this is also from reading, all the important books in the lean canon that you all are very familiar with, is that it was the ability to see problems and talk about them honestly and then bring the right resources to bear on them that really ultimately just seemed to be the thing that made the difference. And that goes back to the research question, we all kind of know that that's what we're supposed to do, and yet it seems to happen so rarely. And so I think all of dynamic work design really basically boiled down to what were the various pieces that you needed in place in order to make that happen on a regular basis. And I think another way of saying the same thing, Mark, is that another observation that has just motivated so much of my work is you take the most screwed up organization and put them in a good crisis, and temporarily, all that nonsense seems to melt away, and the targets are clear, and they become focused, and the person who's most appropriate solves the problem, whether they're the CEO or the janitor or anybody in between. And they get so much work done, and people really report enjoying it. And then the moment the crisis is over, they go back to the same silly stuff that they did before. And it's that second part that always perplexed me. Like, you all had a taste of what good feels like, and then, but they don't hang on to it. And so I think the other way of thinking about dynamic work design is part of it is how do we, keep being honest about the problems we're solving and solve them in a small way. But then I think the other way to think about it is, could we have a small crisis every day that would motivate us to solve that problem rather than waiting till we really screwed something up, which has a lot of risk associated with it. And I think through that lens, then you could see all the things that Toyota, for example, does very well is, we're going to speed up the line until it stops. A little bitty crisis, we're going to solve the problem. Then when we just kind of keep doing it and you get that slow burn. And so I think Don and I, we're staring at that, and we know that that works in this world of manufacturing and assembly. How can we abstract from that a sort of set of ideas where you could apply that to making research grants work, or in your case, making legal contracts? So I think those were the things that really motivated us. And like I said, I think we had many of the puzzle pieces before the puzzle full picture really snapped together for us. And, the book writing process was a very good discipline device to get us to sort of string all those things together in a, hopefully a coherent way.
And that prompts my next question, Nelson. But I just want to make a comment about what you just said. I mean, I spent 23 years in Toyota. 22 of those years, Toyota did really well. We had 1 year, 2009, when the economy collapsed and we struggled. But there was daily a sense of urgency that things were going to fall apart. And so I think that's an important aspect of organizational kind of excellence. But let's talk a little bit.
And actually, Mark, sorry if I could just jump in to follow that. Sorry for the interruption.
No.
One of the things you see in the safety world, and this was a real eye-opener when I moved from the kind of manufacturing R&D world to the energy world, is I've investigated a couple of really high-profile incidents, some of which sadly have had multiple fatalities. And the interesting thing, and you talk to any investigator, is when you look at it backwards, you see an endless number of warning signs, near misses and injuries and things. And when you look at it backwards, you're like, how could we not have seen this? And I think the reason is that they don't have that sense of urgency of that crisis, and they don't have that candor. And so it's easy to explain away, well, okay, this person hurt their hand or had a slip, but it was a one-time thing and we know the circumstance, and they don't take it as a signal of a sort of deeper problem. And I think you obviously know much more about Toyota, but I think the thing that Toyota mastered is to take all those data as a sort of symptom of how the system is running and really use it as a path into a sort of deeper inquiry. And I think the organizations that are not excellent are very adept at explaining those things away as one-offs that they don't need to worry about. So it's almost exactly the opposite of the productive mindset you probably need in that context.
Right. So you like, as you explained at the beginning of our podcast, you spent your career, I think, educating some of the smartest people in the world, and then you've made the decision to like put this thinking out there in a book. What prompted you at this point in time to publish a book that everybody's going to see?
I think there's two reasons for that, or two rationales about it. The first one is very simple, which is we would just want to get the ideas out there to a wider audience. The test bed for the book was both the work that Don and I did with outside companies, but we've also been enormously fortunate that we have in our executive MBA program a project course that he and I teach together, where students have to do a work design project as their assignment for the class. This is our one program where students keep their day job. It was just an enormously fertile opportunity to teach the material. And, I would say I've taught many classes at MIT, but the gains that we get in any year of this class are orders of magnitude bigger than the gains I've been able to get students to get in any other project class. So, the tools really do seem to work, but I teach 120 people a year. Maybe I get another 120 in our exec ed offerings or something like that to get those out there. But then the second answer is, if you go on my hard drive, you'll see that I have chapters from like 2013. So we had started this book more than 10 years ago. And after a year or two, it was just clear we weren't quite ready. The act just didn't really hold together yet. And so we took a step back and wrote some papers for Sloan Management Review and a couple other venues. And then that was a really good choice, because with another 5 or 6 years of practicing and teaching, I think the story got a lot better. And then what really got this version of the book started is that in January 2021, I got COVID, and the MIT rules were that I couldn't be on campus for 10 days. And so I was sitting at home with nothing to do. And so I figured I better start now, because if I don't do it this week, then it's not going to happen. And so that was the silver lining of that otherwise dark cloud in terms of moving it forward.
Well, that's a great book.
So it's COVID, baby.
It is definitely a COVID baby. There's no question.
All right. So maybe we can talk so our audience becomes a little more familiar with the approach itself. Could you describe a dynamic work design? And I think it has 5 principles at its core.
Yeah. So I think let's do the approach first. Is very simple, which is we describe it as the anti-initiative. One of the things I make fun of in almost every class I teach is the sort of standard corporate approach to change, which is t-shirts and coffee mugs and offsites and big posters. And, we have 2 days in a hotel and we get some training and so on and so forth. And I have to say, in 30 years of studying change efforts, I'm not sure I've ever seen that work. And so we try to go to the opposite end of the spectrum, which is pick one problem, go see the work, exactly as Toyota would tell us, and see if you can make progress on that problem fast, 30 to 60 days. And then when you solve that problem, then draw the circle a little bit wider and see if you can then solve the next problem that's around that and build change out in concentric circles. So it is very much a sort of aggressively continuous improvement focused process. Would also say that I think for executives, particularly senior ones, that takes a little bit to get their head around, because there's often this implicit assumption that if I have a big job, I need to do equally big things in order to move my big company forward. And I think that's just seemingly plausible. It's just not how the world works. And the way that Don and I often phrase it is when you go solve a small problem, even if it doesn't make a material impact on the bottom line of your, Fortune 500 organization, you are going to learn a lot about how your organization actually works, and you'll be a much better leader for it. So I think the approach of dynamic work design is sort of aggressively incremental and hands-on. And then with that setup, we have identified 5 principles that we think that are required to design work that is in some sense self-diagnostic, meaning that it will show us the next problem to go solve so that we can get that slow burn or those that daily urgency. And the first of these is very straightforward. The first principle is solve the right problem. One of my biggest regrets of the book is that I wish I had titled that principle solve the right problem and solve the problem right, so that you could get both, that we need to focus on the right thing and use the structured methods and so on. But that principle is basically just a charge to focus on bite-sized pieces of important problems and use structured methods, whether it's the A3 or DMAIC or whatever your preferred version is, to make sure that you actually solve that problem in a fundamental way. Principle number 2 is what we call structure for discovery. And this is one that came together kind of late, but the basic idea is that every job that someone does in the organization should be configured so that the person doing the job actually learns the right lessons. And you would think that this would be a minimal requirement for any job, but in fact, we have an endless number of examples where the feedback that people get from doing their work either doesn't teach them anything, or in worst cases, rewards the wrong behavior, or in many cases, everyone learns to do their job in a slightly different way, and then you create coordination problems. And so the second principle is really all about how do we configure the people's work so that they're getting the feedback that helps them adjust their behavior in the right directions. Third principle is what we call connect the human chain, which essentially boils down to let's leverage the collective intelligence of the organization by making sure that problems quickly get to the person who is in the best position to solve them. So it's essentially a charge to wire together the information flow so that knowledge about a particular issue gets to the right place and gets there quickly. And that principle has an interesting corollary, which is a lot of it is about how you use face-to-face communication and meetings effectively. And one of the things that we have come across over and over again in our practice is that many organizations, at least for our taste, use meetings and electronically mediated communication like Slack and instant messaging and email almost exactly backwards. And if you can flip those two around, you can often get some big gains. Fourth principle is regulate for flow, which is basically our version of the pull techniques that Toyota made so famous. It really boils down to how do you make sure you have the right amount of work in the system so that you're not creating a traffic jam. And then the fifth one we kind of alluded to earlier, Mark, which is what we call visualize the work. And that really, I think, is the key move that helps us take these ideas from the world of physical work into the world of knowledge work. Because one of the things I think we discovered sort of ex post is, in retrospect, it's not a huge surprise that most of the major work design innovations have come in physical work, particularly factories. And that's because physical work, exactly as you said earlier, I think, tends to give you signals when things are going well and when things are going poorly. Knowledge work often has none of that, right? You don't see the work move around the office. You don't know when someone gets stuck. And so the idea behind the last principle is if we can create a kind of digital twin or radar screen or choose your metaphor so that we can see whether knowledge work is moving or not, it often unlocks a lot of that natural problem solving that you would get in other contexts if the work were a little bit more available to us.
Thank you. So I want to ask you, I liked your book when I hit the chapter 3 though, and it starts with what problem you're trying to solve. I knew you stabbed me in the heart. No, because I'll tell you that, and I mean that in a very positive way. It just kind of, it impacted me. I mean, because I'll tell you, and I tell this to many people, that was probably the most asked question in my Toyota career. Every time I presented an idea to a leader or my manager, my boss, and of course I learned to use the same technique. I was asked, what problem are you trying to solve? So tell us, I'd like to hear your perspective on why that's an important question.
So in the book, we describe this interaction that Don had with Mr. Oba. It sounds like you worked with him, Toyota legend, and Don was being a sort of typical American manager of I want to do this and I want to do that and I want to implement the Toyota production system, and they ended up having a little tiff at the end because Mr. Oba just kept asking Don the sort of same question over and over and over again. And Don and I had shared this and taught it a lot, but I think with my academic leanings, here's my theory of why it's such a powerful question, which is that the dominant sort of thinking in psychology today is that we basically have two ways of interacting with the world. So if you've read Dan Kahneman's book, he calls them System 1 and System 2.
Yes.
I like to call them automatic and conscious cognition because I just think it's a little bit more descriptive. But summarizing a huge amount of research, most of what we do during the day comes from that automatic part of our brain, right? Which is basically we kind of exist on habit, and it's enormously efficient and allows us to get a lot of work done without having to think too hard about it. I think, and this is a hypothesis at this point, what makes that question so powerful is that in order to answer it correctly, you really need to take a detour out of your automatic habitual responses and apply some of that expensive, high-powered conscious cognition. And so I think although those automatic habits are productive, that automatic part of our brains is in some sense small c conservative. And if you kind of dig into the mechanics, basically the answer your automatic parts of your brain will supply to you are the ones that have worked in the past, okay? Which is great in most cases. But when we have a problem that hasn't been solved and has really been a huge pain in our backsides, we need a little bit of novel thinking. In order to get that, we need that conscious processing function. And I think that question is a pretty magical way of forcing that detour from sort of one thinking mode into the other. Because what the automatic function does is it's called in the literature association. Basically, it just goes from situation to solution, and it does it instantly, and it doesn't kind of take the logical steps in the middle, whereas I think the conscious processor is probably better at that. Now, to be fair, I have yet to stick students in an MRI machine and scan their brains while they're doing, problem-solving projects, so I don't know that for a fact as of yet. But that's my suspicion as to why it works. And I think we've had exactly the same experience, I'm sure, that both of you had, which is, appropriately deployed, it is just the amazingly sharp knife to cut through a lot of BS in the organization and get people to focus on what really matters. And, often you have the experience of people are doing things just because they've done them before, or it seems like the right thing to do. And there's surprising little thought that goes into it. And just getting them to focus on the problem statement, I think, eliminates that like no other question that I've probably seen in the course of my career. So that's my guess as to why it works. Someday brain scanning technology will improve enough that we can actually go test that in the lab, but that's probably a ways off.
Well, that's a pretty amazing answer. Thank you. I mean, I've also found that probably why Mr. Oba kept asking that question repeatedly is business leaders, believe it or not, often don't know. And I mean, because their context is that they've they feel there's a lot of problems every day.
Yeah.
So which one do you want me to pick? But in fact, what Mr. Obo is asking was what's the real kind of business problem that will help the organization progress. But go ahead.
Let me just add to that. Sorry, Mark. I think the other thing, and maybe we'll get to this more in a moment, is I think once you start calling out specific problems, just like when you call out specific projects, it also forces leaders to prioritize, right? I need to work on this problem rather than that one. And particularly since I've taken over this role in the Leadership Center at MIT, I've really come to appreciate how few leaders are willing to make the really hard decisions about what they're going to work on and what they're not going to work on. And I think one of the aversions to that question is exactly that. If I'm going to focus on problem A, then I'm not going to focus on problems B or C. And it's just psychologically uncomfortable to know that I'm leaving important issues untouched. But, to think that you're going to work on everything at once is obviously totally delusional. But I think it's a very comfortable delusion that it takes some doing to get over. And there's another version of this, which is I see all the time, which is it's very hard to choose between, the 3 projects that we're going to develop this year because we have 6 good ideas. And I've come to say that, one of the most important jobs of leaders is to say no to good ideas. And, that's why leaders get the big bucks, because that's a super unfun part of your job, actually. But if you don't do it, right, or if you don't prioritize problem solving, as you both know, nothing gets done. And that's why we get into this kind of bureaucratic tangles that I think, are so counterproductive in many cases.
Great. So in chapter 4, structure for discovery, you talk about target setting as a key step. That was intriguing for me. What's important for setting good targets to actually drive them?
So I think the thing that people do wrong in this area, Don and I jokingly call, what part of 17% don't you understand? And this came from an unnamed company that he and I worked with a lot, which was, when junior people would go to bosses and say, well, I don't understand what I'm supposed to do here, or I need help. The response was always, what part of 17% don't you understand? And the idea being is that, there is a version of management which says it's the job of leaders to give big, crazy targets to the people that work for them. And it's the job of the people who work for them to figure it out. And, that's what I pay you for, Josh. So go get it. And I personally think that that is broken in so many different ways. It would probably take the rest of the day to, go through all the things. But I think what's really important for target setting is ultimately it needs to be a 2-way process rather than a 1-way process, right? So it's the role of leaders to set targets and to explain what needs to be done. But if the folks who have to go get that don't understand the intent behind those targets and have not had a hand in sort of setting them, it can lead to the most unbelievably pathological behaviors. So, as one example, this is from very early in my career, I was working on a project with a cereal company. And when they would be behind at the end of the fiscal year, what they would do is they would literally fill rail cars with cereal, push it off the lot, and their accounting rules were such that once the rail car moved over the property line, they were allowed to count that as revenue. So, June 30, the rail cars would go over the line, they would recognize all this revenue, and then July 1, they would bring them back and they would decrement it. And they had like $100 million swing, which was just completely like a phony accounting thing. But that's because someone gave someone a target without understanding the intent behind it. And it led to all these, everyone who's ever managed salespeople is familiar with different variants of that. So I think it's making target setting a discussion so that people really know the intent behind what's going on. And in some cases, the folks on the ground will say, well, no, we can do better than that, or here's this other thing we can do. It's making it a feedback process rather than this sort of just top-down process is the most important part. Now, there's a couple of different techniques we talk about how to make that happen, but I think that's the core idea that underlies them.
Okay, you talk about organizational dynamics, and you actually discuss something, LEW, late expensive, as it applies to production engineer. Maybe you can explain a little further what organizational dynamics help to address this issue.
Yeah, so first off, late, expensive, and wrong was a diagnosis that some MIT colleagues had imposed on Harley-Davidson's product development process many years ago. I had no hand in that. But the essential dynamic there, which I have now documented in sort of endless different places, is people throughout the organization are often faced with the choice between delivering today's results and investing in tomorrow's capabilities, right? So that could be as simple as, do I do maintenance on a piece of equipment? Or do I run this test on this particular product? Or do I do another round of digital design before we move into hardware? And what the research, my own and others, suggests is that most organizations tend to overemphasize the daily delivery of results and underweight the investments that are required in those capabilities. Again, whether it's maintenance or knowledge development or whatever it might be. And the reason for that is the dynamics that ensue, which basically boils down to, if I focus on today's results, I get an immediate feedback from the environment that, okay, I shipped these widgets, let's just say as an example, right? And my brain anchors on it. Well, I worked an extra hour today and an extra hour's worth of output went out the door, right? That's a very easy situation for my brain to learn from. And so I'm very likely to repeat that experience. In contrast, if I invest in capability development, so it might be I learned a new skill or I did some maintenance and essentially I prevented a defect from happening, that outcome only happens with a delay. So it's much less likely that we'll learn that those things were happening. And then on top of that, particularly in prevention activities, if I do everything right, nothing happens. And it turns out that our brains are really not good at learning in situations where I make an investment and the outcome is nothing, right? And so the example I always use in class is that, if I do everything that the Surgeon General tells me, so I go to the gym and I drink skim milk and I don't drink too much and I don't smoke and so on and so forth, right? What's the feedback I get from the environment? Nothing, right? I don't get sick. I don't go to the doctor. I have a long, healthy, happy life, which of course is the state we desire. But our brains were not designed, at least from an evolutionary perspective, to sort of really learn the right lesson in that environment, because we learn much better when we get visceral feedback, right? So if I touch a hot stove and burn myself, I learn really quickly to quit doing that. If I live a very healthy lifestyle, nothing happens. And so that's why it's easy to learn to quit touching hot stoves. And yet, even today, like, it takes effort to go to the gym, or it's, hard work to resist that French fry or whatever. We just don't learn those things naturally. And I think the same thing applies in the organizational setting. We all know that we're supposed to do maintenance, and we all know we're supposed to go to training, and we all know that I'm supposed to accept those Microsoft updates every time they show up on my computer in the operating system. And yet they're the easiest thing in the world not to do, because it requires that sort of conscious attention. And so I think this is the root of a lot of the firefighting and chaos that we were talking about a little bit earlier, because it's just very easy to learn the wrong lessons. And I think another way of explaining why Lean is so successful, or the dynamic work design tools, is because they're trying to redesign the environment so that we get better feedback more quickly from doing the right things, so that we can learn the right lessons as a sort of normal part of our day-to-day.
All right. I've got some questions to continue the conversation. In particular, Nelson, I want to, you've touched upon this throughout our conversation so far, but I really want to kind of focus in on helping folks apply the framework, so to get kind of practical about it. One example that you cover in the book is distinguishing between handoffs and huddles to keep work flowing. Could you talk about the difference and why this matters? Perhaps this relates to your comment earlier about how people use meetings versus using systems like Slack or whatnot to communicate.
Yeah, so I think this was a big insight for us. It took a while to come together, and I would say this is something that I hope is a novel contribution from some of the work that we've done. And the basic idea is this: what is face-to-face communication good for, right? So when is it wise for, if we're transferring work, for example, Josh, for you and I to have a face-to-face communication rather than me to email you an attachment, for example? If you sort of dive into the communication literature and so on, basically what face-to-face communication is particularly good for is when we have to resolve ambiguity or uncertainty, right? So if you take a simple example, right? If I'm picking the restaurant, right, I can text you, Josh, I'll meet you at Tate or something like that, right? But if you and I are going to decide together where we're going to go, right, as everyone knows, that can be 12 texts back and forth before we feel, well, I feel like something healthy, but I'm not sure, and, I'm across town or whatever. Whereas if you and I have a face-to-face communication, right, we can probably figure out where we're going to go eat in 20 seconds, right? And so I think the work design analog of that is, if you think of a chain of work moving through the organization, whether it could be we're making a car or we're processing an invoice, right? There are some junctures where the work is being transferred from one person to the next, where it's very predictable what you're going to get, right? So if you think of, Mark, probably your Toyota assembly line, right? I know exactly what I'm going to get each time unless something's gone wrong. We don't need a lot of communication because I'm going to get exactly the same piece and I'm going to do exactly the same thing every time. In contrast, there's other places where maybe we're designing a new product or we're trying to figure out a really complicated defect or problem, where that handoff is very uncertain, and so therefore we probably should have a conversation about it when I'm handing you the work. So the basic idea of handoff and huddles is to go through each of those junctures in that chain of getting work done and ask yourself, is the work certain enough that we can just hand it from one spot to the next, or should we have a meeting basically to do the transfer? And I think the part about email is, what we have discovered is that people often use text, Slack, email to transfer pretty complicated information. And that turns out, in our experience, to be a pretty bad medium for doing that. And the result is you get tons of iteration, right? So, go through your email inboxes, and how many of those messages are long chains that have multiple entries on them, right? What that is probably is evidence of your iterating. Well, Mark, what do you think about that? Well, I think this, and what do you think about that? And you're going back and forth. And almost certainly that would be far more efficiently done if you and Mark just talked to each other, right, and had a 2-minute phone call or face-to-face meeting or whatever. So the basic idea here is that when you're designing processes of getting work done, you want to put the face-to-face communication in the places where it's most helpful, and those places are where there's some kind of ambiguity or uncertainty that needs to be processed. Now, the reason I say that we're using email and meetings backward is think of the following cartoon, which most people have participated in, right? I go to a meeting, boss gets up, hour-long meeting, slides go on for 52 or 53 minutes, right? We're going to redo our strategy, or we're going to change this, or we're going to change that, right? There's lots of information being processed. There's 1 or 2 softball questions at the end of the meeting, then the meeting's over, and then, Josh, you and I might be walking back to our offices, and we start the conversation of, oh my God, we got to change everything now because we're headed in a different direction. And so all the ambiguity processing that should have been happening in that meeting is now going to be done in dyadic hallway conversations or via Slack or via the emails that we're going to trade with each other when we get home at night. And that is just an enormously inefficient way to get things done. So we have discovered that often a daily meeting, can replace, if it's well designed, can replace hundreds of emails a day if you design the meeting so that, okay, let's bring all the uncertainty into the meeting. We're going to talk about it quickly. We're going to make some assignments, and then we'll, go back to work. And maybe we need to meet every day or twice a day or once a week or whatever. But that is typically way more efficient and satisfying than trying to process all that uncertainty via Slack or via messages. And so just to give you a couple sort of simple versions of how you might think about using this, one of Don's versions of this when he was running a company called Intermatic is if he was ever copied on an email that had more than 5 responses, he would immediately reply all and say, please take this off email and go find, a room and have a meeting. Now, they were co-located, but they could get it done. The version I have at MIT is I have several teams now that report, to me. And what I try to enforce with them is, look, I will meet with you all on whatever frequency you want. We can meet every day. And again, we're co-located. But the trade is please don't send me an email unless it's an emergency. But I would much rather you backlog all the things we need to talk about. We'll meet in the morning. We can go through them very quickly because email, it's just everybody's overwhelmed, and I'm certainly. And so I think that has tended to work really, really well. And when you get kind of the use of those things to match what it's good for, there's some pretty dramatic efficiency gains that are often out there available to you.
So you mentioned co-location a couple of times, and I'm curious how this sort of the basic thinking in what we're talking about now, how you might sort of apply that in the challenge many organizations have these days, especially coming out of COVID, of just, distribution, distributed teams, co-location, working online, working in person. Does this sort of line of thinking have anything that pertains to that challenge that many managers face?
Yeah, and I think that the irony of that is that as we are increasingly distributed and globally distributed, I actually think it means that more time and energy has to go into designing the few face-to-face interactions that we do have. And I do really feel sorry for companies that have, people on every continent because, as you all well know, there's like 2 hours a day when you can meet, and even then someone's meeting at 6 a.m. or 10 at night, right? If face-to-face communication is important, which I believe it is for any task that has uncertainty in it, you really need those hours if we're going to move this product forward or deal with this irate customer or whatever. And so I think the takeaway from that is if you're designing a work process that is moving around the globe, you need to be incredibly painstakingly clear about what is the frequency with which we need to meet, and make sure that all the information is available so that when we get on that Zoom call at 10 p.m. or 6 a.m. or wherever it is, everything is there so that we can make full advantage of that precious hour that we have. I think if you go back in the good old days of when we were all in the same office, I think design was important, but I think it was less important because everyone was kind of in the same office and I could walk down to your cube or office and knock on the door, and that's just not available. And when we swap that for Slack, or IM or Microsoft Teams or whatever, which is I think what we do now, that's just a way worse medium to process that uncertainty. So I think it really puts a premium on getting the design of the work crystal clear, particularly where are the places where we need communication, where are those key junctures, and make sure those are very carefully structured.
Yeah, that definitely resonates with us. We were pre-COVID a in-office organization. We're currently a distributed organization. And then we're a part of what's called the Lean Global Network with institutes all around the world. And so we get together once a year. And you can imagine the effectiveness or ineffectiveness that defines those meetings.
I mean, I would even tell you, sorry to interrupt, that
okay.
Don and I were sending chapters back and forth and tiffing with each other a little bit. And we even realized that we probably weren't meeting enough. He was on the West Coast at the time. We developed our own little process of, okay, let's write a draft and then let's have a face-to-face meeting to talk about our differences, steps, rather than just putting comments, in the Microsoft Word, because those are really easy to misinterpret, right? Well, why don't you like the genius that I just wrote in this paragraph? And then I would get all upset or he would get all upset. And, if we had a conversation like this, it was much easier to quell the emotions associated with that. So we had to, take a little bit of our own medicine in order to get the, get a smooth process that worked for us.
I think we've all had that experience.
Yeah.
So there's a whole host of techniques and stuff that you present in the book, and we could go through them one by one. Obviously, we're going to be kind of selective here with what we can cover. But one that I'm curious to get your take on, you talk about seagull management. Could you explain what that is and why leaders need to avoid it?
Yeah. So this came from the same unnamed company that had what part of 17%, don't you understand? But, seagull management is that, some crisis would happen and managers would fly in like a flock of seagulls and then sort of, poop on everything and then fly away. And it was not a compliment when they said someone was engaging in seagull management. But I think, the reason we talk about it is, well, let me back up. So I think one of the things that I've now come to appreciate more deeply that I am part of our leadership center at MIT is I think often as leaders get more senior, they really underestimate the symbolic impact of their actions. And the way that I think about it is that, a colleague of mine once said that he's like, my jokes were never funnier than when I was chief executive officer. And I think the thing that people don't understand when they get to those corner offices is that everybody is looking at them to try to figure out what behaviors are appropriate in this organization, right? They are the chief role model, whether they like it or not.
That's right.
And so I think as a consequence, with the best of intentions, leaders often have really pathological impacts on their organization, right? So as an example, in many organizations that we have worked with, a problem won't get attention, it won't get attention, and it won't get attention until suddenly it becomes very public or something's gone wrong or a big product is late or, in the energy context, maybe you had an accident or a near miss. And then suddenly, every senior leader comes out of the woodwork. Well, why did this happen? And, they bring all these resources to bear on solving that problem. But I think what's inadvertently being communicated there is that the way that you move up in that organization is you wait until something's gone really sideways and then you jump in at the last minute and try and save the day. Well, no organization wants that, right? I think they're communicating almost exactly the wrong message. Right. And so one of the reasons that we really preach the start small, get your hands dirty, go find a small problem and solve it is, I think, number one, senior leaders are going to learn a lot about how their organization actually works. But I think number two, I think the role modeling is extremely powerful. Like the boss is down here, like helping us fix the printers or is trying to understand what's going on. And I think that communicates that the way you move up in the organization is that you get your hands dirty and you start fixing real problems rather than kind of waiting till something's gone horribly sideways and then kind of bringing the cavalry in temporarily until there's another bigger issue and then the cavalry goes and works somewhere else.
The principle of work visualization then really just critical for that. I remember this experience I had. I'm managing a coffee shop when I worked for Starbucks. These executives showed up. They pulled out this thing called the Siren's Eye, which is the schematic for how like mugs and things should be displayed on the shelving. And they could match what was printed in that Siren's Eye with what they could see on my shelves. And so every executive who would visit would have a conversation with me about the mugs on my shelves. Now, mug sales as a percent of my store's revenue was like nothing. Right. But they could see it, right? Like they could kind of see the mugs, they could see the standard, and we could have a conversation about it. Meanwhile, things like, the quality of a mocha beverage or, the things that actually matter to a customer, that actually matter to the business were difficult for those executives to see. Even in an environment like that where the work is in fact visual, right? People are moving espresso around and stuff like that versus in the knowledge work environment that we talked about earlier. Anyway, providing mechanisms, means by which those leaders can see and understand what's actually happening to give them something to engage with other than just the seagulling.
Yeah.
Is of course critically important there.
I mean, I think this is a really deep question that I don't entirely know the answer to, which is how do you make those interventions substantive rather than performative, right? So I think that's a really great example with the mugs, right? Because anyone could walk in like, okay, I can compare this to this, and then I can have a really good conversation with Josh about his mug placement, and then, I'll feel like I've done something. And you see this in the safety world over and over and over again, right? I think with the best of intentions, managers want to role model good safety practices. They'll walk in and, Mark, are you wearing your hearing protection and safety glasses and stuff like that? But, I think honestly, the folks on the ground look at that stuff probably exactly the same way that you did when you got your 14th lecture on the mug placement. Like, really? This is not the biggest problem I had to solve, right? And so I think sort of the difference is really the process, right? Which is, have we identified the biggest problem that you have, and have I tried to sort of help you solve it or make progress on it? And I think that's also scary for senior leaders. I don't know how to run a coffee shop, right? And so if your problem is the landlord or your supply or whatever, right? And I think it's easy for leaders to kind of get distracted because they don't want to be embarrassed, right? Because they don't really know the problem. And so one of the people that works in our leadership center says that curiosity is the ultimate superpower. And I think there is some truth to that, right? You do need leaders that kind of have enough confidence in their meta problem solving skill that they can walk into a situation they know nothing about, ask a bunch of questions. And if I don't know how to fix your supply chain, Josh, well, okay, I'll keep working on it until I figure it out, and I'll probably learn a lot. But I honestly think we don't, and I'm in the industry, I'm not sure we train managers with that degree of kind of confidence and humility that need to go together. And, and I think for Don and I, we got some nice lessons in this. We could not sequence a genome if our life depended on it, I promise you. Sure. But, being willing to work with our friends at Broad who had all this technical expertise, right? Once we understood their work a little bit, okay, now we got some ideas that come from somewhere else, and we can probably help move this forward. But I do think it's so easy for all these things to fall into that performative zone if you're not careful. 100%. And Mark, to go back to the question you raised me earlier, I think that's why that what problem you're trying to solve question is so important, because if you don't do that first, okay, now it's just rituals that we're going through rather than we're moving the business forward in any kind of meaningful way.
That's right. Never once did I think mug sales was my problem.
Yeah, right. Exactly.
So another theme of the book is people development, which is something we talk about a lot, we work on a lot, we promote a lot to think about with lean organizations. So can you talk a little bit about people development as it relates to dynamic work design?
Yeah, I think, and again, like most of my answers, there's probably two parts to this. The first is, I think, if you buy this idea that, the work should be constantly surfacing the next problem to go solve, that just leaves you with almost an infinite number of opportunities for people to build their problem-solving skills, build their confidence, learn to do the work better. I would say one of the more gratifying moments in my sort of teaching life, broadly construed, is, probably about 5 years into our work with Broad. I remember talking to Sheila Dodge at one point, and she said, I'm pretty confident I could run almost any factory at this point, even if it was outside of, sort of the life sciences. And I was like, yeah, that's pretty impressive, right? You've taken a molecular biologist. She now understands workflow. She knows the questions to ask, and she would walk into another domain and she would know what she was doing. But I think, she had kind of the meta skills and confidence that she could figure out and go forward. So I think that's great. And I think, that style of working offers a lot of really substantive developmental opportunities that I think takes you to a really good place. The second thing I would say, though, is our experience has been, and I don't know, it'd be interesting to hear from you two what your experience has been, is there is a small minority of people, for reasons I don't entirely understand, that just cannot work this way. They don't like sharing their problems. They don't like surfacing defects. They don't like the kind of authenticity and humility that's required to have that daily meeting in front of the visual management board. And I do think, as much as it pains me to admit, that if you have done all the structural stuff right and people are still choosing not to work that way, then maybe they need to work somewhere else. And again, it's been a tiny fraction. And I've seen this in the safety world too, right? If you do everything right in the safety context, so people are properly trained, they have the proper equipment, they have the right environment, on and on and on, and you still choose not to wear your safety glasses, or you still choose not to put in your earplugs or whatever, like, oh, okay, this just isn't the right job for you. Now, I feel like that's the thing that happens last, and you need to do everything right before that. But to not have that kind of personnel selection sanction thing is sort of the last step, I think sets you up for trouble because you're leaving people in there can be potentially toxic to all the rest of the good work that you've done. Again, I would say this is fewer than 2 or 3% of the people we've come across, but it has happened enough times that I sort of feel obligated to warn people it's potentially out there.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know that we have a different perspective or experience what you're describing. I think the important sort of fact, if you will, or statistic in that is that it rarely happens. It's the 2 or 3%. And just to encourage executives and leaders to think of this as an extreme minority of cases, and that likely that challenging performer, as you perceive it in your organization, isn't challenging just because of their innate, inability.
Exactly right.
But the environment that you bought are responsible for creating. So some self-reflection perhaps would be the right mindset.
Totally agree. And again, I always sort of try to point out that you really have to do all the structural design things first. And if you've created an environment that is completely conducive to somebody being successful and they still choosing not to, okay, yeah, maybe that's not working. But I would also say that, for every one of those people, there'll be 15 that will come out of their shell and become performance in a way that you could never have anticipated. We have that little story in the book. I think it's in the Human Chain chapter about, this purchasing clerk that, was a huge curmudgeon and a big pain in everyone's ass. And then, suddenly became one of Mark's best employees because now suddenly he felt like he was actually moving the system forward in a really productive way. So there are many more, I think, of those happy stories than the bad ones.
Yeah, totally. That's been our experience too. So my final question, then I'll turn it over to Mark to kind of wrap things up. But I'm curious, we're often in situations where we get asked to help with this, or we're just in a position to do this, which is to kind of pitch or sell these ideas similar to what's in your book, to sort of the executives, the business leaders. And I'm curious, kind of what's your elevator pitch, if you will? What would be the things you'd kind of distill this down into for a business leader in particular who's just like, look, man, I've got the street that I'm accountable to, and we need to deliver some business value quickly.
Yeah, in some sense, my first instinct is you're asking the wrong guys because, Don and I have, we've said for years, you give us 90 minutes, we can sell almost anyone on dynamic work design, but it's got to be a really tall building where we can get all our ideas across in the elevator ride. But I think that said, I think the pitch that we have had the most success with, and which I genuinely believe, is where we can hook senior leaders is, what's the biggest problem that you have, or I think maybe a little bit more accurately, what is that sort of operational issue that is just a perennial pain in your backside? And, it's not so much like, the market went south for us this quarter, because that tends to be kind of random variation, but, we just can't get this delivered on time, or we just can't execute, or our supply chain never works, stuff like that. And I think if we can get them to articulate that and then say, hey, we can help you with that, and let us come run a quick experiment and we'll show you that we can make things better. That has been definitely the most successful path for us, is you have to connect with something that they're struggling with. I would also say in teaching, the gambit that probably works the best for me is just to start talking with the firefighting and chaos part. So we have this quote, I think it's in the first page of the book, which I often start the teaching with, which is a student I had that once said, I know I'm in trouble when I show up on Monday morning, I make a to-do list, work my ass off all week, and then on Friday afternoon I check my list and I haven't gotten anything done. And when I show that to an audience, 99 times out of 100, they're like, oh yeah, that happens to me too. And the moment that happens, then I know I got them. So I think if we can connect with the problems they're experiencing and offer them a path out of those frustrations, that has definitely worked the best for us in terms of getting people engaged. And then I think the start small strategy, if we can get them over the hump, really works well too, because once people can see real results, then I think it's pretty easy to go forward. And if you contrast that with the t-shirt coffee mug model where, hey, if you invest in this 2 years later, you're going to be a lean company or a dynamic work design company or whatever. It's the rare executive that has the patience to wait 2 or 3 years to see the results.
All right. So I got the job of wrapping things up here. Nelson, thank you very much. This has been excellent discussion. Maybe you could talk, obviously you put a lot of effort into getting this book completed based on a lot of experience you've had over decades, and now it's out there. Any reflections about where you see things going now that you have it out? What's next?
Well, so I'll answer that question again in two ways, which seems to be my norm. What's next more broadly? The question that I get more than any other, probably by a factor of 10 right now, is what about AI? And partly that's an MIT thing, but I think that's more broadly. And my own particular view of this is that there's no question that AI is going to change our lives in very material ways, but I actually think it is going to put an even greater premium on the kinds of things that we collectively do. And I think it's best captured by one of my former students that has this phrase I love, which is he says, there's few ways to lose money faster than automating a process you don't understand. And I think that's going to be very true in the, machine learning AI enabled world. And I think it's going to put a real premium on understanding how the work actually gets done and then using these new tools in very strategic ways. And so, I think that's, broadly what's going to sort of the next 5 or 10 years in work design, lean, whatever you want to call it. It's going to be finding smart ways to take advantage of these new technologies that actually works. I have a PhD student who's studying the use of some of these tools in the healthcare context right now. And this might be a podcast for another time, but some of the stories that she's coming back with would curl your toes in terms of the kind of fights that providers are having with the technology that's supposed to be there to help them. I think for Don and me, what I hope follows the book will be some kind of guidebook or workbook or something like that. So we've invented, not invented, but we've developed a lot of different sort of graphics and techniques, and we have our own little variant of the A3 diagram, which you're all very familiar. And, one of the things that happened in the book, I think we were very lucky with our editor, but the book really is a case for change, and it's to kind of get the core idea out of it. And many of the more nuts and bolts tools and techniques kind of got left on the cutting room floor. So I'd like to put that all together so that hopefully people would walk away from the book thinking, oh, this seems like a good idea and something we want to do. And then the second volume would be more of a how-to that goes with that. And then I think beyond that, I am extremely interested in how this next generation of technologies is going to connect to some of these work design ideas. And so I think research-wise, that'd probably be the thing I'll be working on quite a bit going forward.
Excellent. Well, Nelson, we really appreciate your time.
Yeah.
Thanks for this wonderful contribution.
Oh, thanks. Thanks you guys for having me. I really appreciate it.
Podcast, and thanks for the book, too. It's always nice to hear kind of different perspectives, different stories, different cases, different insights on similar principles, similar practices. So we are appreciative for that and of course, for your time today.
My pleasure. And I hope, the book helps LEI and the whole community just make the case, right? Because the book is really...
I think so.
We didn't really talk about this that much, but I view the book as kind of a Rosetta Stone in some sense that, helps people see common threads through a bunch of different techniques. There are some new pieces, hopefully, that Don and I added, but there's a lot of it that was out there that we have hopefully interpreted in a sort of less ritualistic way, just so people can see the core idea. And so
sure.
I hope it's helpful to you and your community. So fingers crossed, I guess.
I think so. All right.
Then.
Thanks, Nelson.
All right. Thanks, guys. Great. Nice meeting you, Mark.
Nice meeting you.